all of those former prime ministers, whether they're Liz Truss, whether they are, David Cameron, all of them need security, and that security is expensive. So the bill and again, it's all kind of kept under wraps, but the bill for protecting high-profile politicians has gone up and up and up. And that means that with Harry and Meghan, there's a real issue, basically, with finding the money for it.
And it's Ukraine Independence Day today, but it's also a big day for Andy Burnham because he is in Ukraine. He's meeting with President Zelensky. What are we expecting from that meeting?
Well, this is, of course, Andy Burnham's first foreign trip as Prime Minister, and I think it's quite significant that he has decided to go to Ukraine for not only to celebrate their Independence Day, but also for this meeting of the Coalition of the Willing, which he is going to co-chair. So really sort of showing that British and international support for Ukraine continues. But he is also going to be saying that he is going to allow Ukraine to have access to blueprints which would allow them to produce their own versions of British and French-made cruise missiles. And so that is showing that Ukraine will be able to continue to use these missiles to strike further into Russian territory. And we've seen them do that already recently with drones in particular. But this is, giving extra ammunition literally to Ukraine to continue the war.
Yeah, we'll speak to the Defence Minister about exactly how that will work and how quickly that production line might be set up in Ukraine. I think that's going to be crucial. Elsewhere, thinking about Parliament, which will return at some point, there's a story today in The Times by our very own Anna Mihailova, our political editor. The number of former MPs with parliamentary passes has increased from 330 to 464 in 2 years. Terry, some people might be surprised to hear that former MPs get full access to the estate. Why is that?
Well, yes, not all of them do. There have been limits recently put on the conditions, like you have to apply for a pass within 6 months of leaving Parliament. You have to have served a certain period of time, but many former MPs carry on getting that access to Parliament. And you would partly expect this because obviously at the last election 2 years ago, large numbers of MPs either stood down or lost their seats. So there were 350 MPs who left Parliament for one reason or another at the last election, and some of those will have chosen to keep the pass so they can kind of go back and visit. But some of the concerns have been in the past that former MPs were using this as a way to get access. You're not allowed to use your parliamentary pass as an ex-MP to carry out lobbying, but some concerns have been raised that perhaps you shouldn't give this many people this much access to Parliament when they are no longer working there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that question about lobbying is one that occurs every year or so when we talk about MPs and having access to Parliament. But the sheer number now, I wonder whether that might put more pressure on the parliamentary estate. Shall we end, Terry, with this story about David Lammy? Because it's turned out that he is the person responsible for giving Andy Burnham, the Prime Minister, a fake number for Donald Trump's Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles. Not intentionally, it should be said, but it looks like the original source of this number could be, quite difficult for David Lammy and the UK.
It's a complicated one because, as we know, that Andy Burnham ended up exchanging messages briefly with someone who was pretending to be Susie Wiles, and this number seemed to have been passed on by David Lammy, who of course has lots of very good and authentic contacts in Washington, but this clearly was not one of them. But apparently Susie Wiles has had her phone security compromised in the past and has had to change her contact details. So it seems to be that there is persons or people out there pretending to be Susie Wiles and managing to convince other people that's who it was. But of course, eventually this was reported to the proper authorities, checked with the White House, and Downing Street found out that it was not in fact her.
Yeah, and it looks like the source of this phone number might actually have been quite worrying. It looks like it was a Russian cyber warfare unit, so I think there are some questions there for ministers going forward. Terry, great to have you with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate.
That is political reporter Terry Stiastny. Look, Andy Burnham is in Ukraine. We've been talking a little bit about his visit on the programme this morning. Are we expecting to hear much from him today?
Well, they've done one major announcement, but yes, there will be more. There's a lot of kind of pomp and ceremony going into this. He's getting some kind of honorary award on behalf of Britain in recognition for our support of Ukraine. And of course, we've already heard about us effectively giving the blueprints for our Storm Shadow missiles, enabling Ukraine to build its own missiles that can carry out long-range strikes in Russia, on Russian soil. So the support is there, and I think this is all about messaging. It's all about Andy Burnham saying, effectively, nothing has changed. All of the same support that my predecessors gave you, I will give you. I am shoulder to shoulder.
And I suppose that does then open up some questions about defence spending at home in terms of how much the Chancellor is willing to commit in the budget, whether we're likely to hear anything more about those commitments, especially because John Healey was the Defence Secretary and he had some strong views. Are you hearing any whispers in Westminster about what might be coming in the next couple of months?
So we did an interview with John Healey a few weeks ago in which he said that the critical decision is when will we spend 3% of GDP on defence. John Healey felt so strongly about this issue, he quit over it. And he said at the time when he was Defence Secretary, we should spend that in 2030. So up from kind of current levels, I think at 2.3, 2.4% to 3% by 2030. An enormous jump. And much bigger than the current profile. But ever since they got into power, they've refused to commit to that timeline. And when we spoke to John Healey, he suggested that this is actually a matter for the spending review next year. So it may be one that actually gets put off. In the short term, they've got to find an extra 4.7 billion for defence, which was one of Keir Starmer's parting gifts, an unfunded defence pledge. So they'll need to find some money. But the bigger question, this kind of quantum jump in defence spending, that is one that looks like it's going to be parked until next year.
Yeah, they're going to have plenty of difficult decisions in that budget to come, whether they come this year or in the next couple of years. Steve, just thinking about domestic politics, Prince Harry and Meghan are returning to the UK, and it sparked this question about how much taxpayers should foot the bill for their security. What are you hearing in Westminster about that? Is it something that you think ministers will be involved in or will try to stay away from?
So there is a committee somewhere in the bowels or attached to the Home Office, but it's technically independent, called RAVEC, which is even the people that chair it is all kind of cloaked in secrecy. But they are looking at it again. They are looking at it because there is a very big difference between a hypothetical decision on whether they will be provided with security if they come to the UK and if they are here, should they get security, and that changes the conversation. So my colleague Matt Dathan splashed a story about that on Friday, Saturday, that they are actually reconsidering that and they're looking at it again. Because look, there is obviously a row. This is enormously expensive, £5 million, etc., etc. But undeniably, there will be a risk, right? They are very high-profile people. There is a risk they'll be targeted, and the British state will need to take that into account. Now, one of the fascinating things about this committee and why it's struggling to find the money and why it's fighting it tooth and nail is because we've got so many former prime ministers. Like we used to get prime ministers, a decade-ish in power or whatever. We've had, we all know the figure, right? 7 in just over 10 years now. And all of those former prime ministers, whether they're Liz Truss, whether they are, David Cameron, all of them need security. And that security is expensive. So the bill and again, it's all kind of kept under wraps, but the bill for protecting high-profile politicians has gone up and up and up. And that means that with Harry and Meghan, there's a real issue, basically, with finding the money for it.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Steve. Before we let you go, I can see that you're in Westminster. Have you, on your travels wandering the corridors, come across any of the number of lost pictures, artworks, portraits, which apparently have gone missing over the last couple of years?
I have not, but I was very sad to hear that there are thieves in the Commons that are stealing pictures. No, but I mean it's a very unusual place to work, the Commons. You know this better than anyone, Kate, but it's just festooned with all this artwork from yesteryear and all these pictures, predominantly of men, has to be said. And I think there are a couple of Emily Thornberry once campaigned to try to get more women on the walls, and they've tried to change that. But it's, so some of it's got nicked, which is obviously pretty extraordinary. But then we did have a period just last year, at the end of last year, when someone planted a device in the Commons in the chamber while they were visiting. So things can go amiss.
Yeah, they can. I'm sure somebody will be looking into that to see if they can find them. Steve, thanks very much. Great to have you with us as always.